The Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the longest and most brutal proxy war of the Cold War. It pitted communist North Vietnam, backed by the Soviet Union and China, against South Vietnam, supported by the United States and its allies. After the First Indochina War drove out French colonial forces, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel. The North, led by Ho Chi Minh, sought to unify the country under communism. The South resisted, with heavy U.S. military and financial aid starting in the late 1950s. American involvement escalated massively after the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. U.S. forces peaked at over 500,000 troops, fighting a mix of jungle warfare, guerrilla tactics, and large-scale battles. Meanwhile, the North used the Ho Chi Minh Trail to infiltrate the South, supported by Soviet weapons and Chinese logistics. The war saw carpet bombing, chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, and televised combat that turned U.S. public opinion against the conflict. After the Tet Offensive in 1968, American confidence in victory eroded. In 1973, the U.S. withdrew. In 1975, Saigon fell to communist forces. Over 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 million Vietnamese died. The Vietnam War became a textbook case of Cold War proxy failure, militarily costly, politically divisive, and strategically humiliating. If you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps more people find this kind of content. Nicaraguan Contra War. After the Sandinista Revolution overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in 1979, Nicaragua turned sharply left. The new government had ties with Cuba and the Soviet Union, which alarmed the United States. In response, the U.S. began secretly funding and training anti-communist rebels known as the Contras, former soldiers, rural fighters, and political enemies of the Sandinistas. The war was fought mostly in the countryside. The Contras used guerrilla tactics, ambushing convoys, sabotaging bridges, attacking small towns, and disrupting farming operations. Their goal was to wear down the Sandinista army, drain resources, and create political instability. Meanwhile, the Sandinistas fortified the cities, built strongholds in the north, and launched counterattacks to push the rebels back toward the Honduran border. Major battles included repeated assaults on northern towns like Jalapa and Esteli. Both sides used landmines, ambushes, and forced recruitment. The conflict displaced thousands of civilians and damaged vital infrastructure. Despite heavy U.S. support, the Contras failed to topple the government. In 1987, international pressure and growing fatigue pushed both sides toward peace. By 1990, elections were held, and the Sandinistas lost power. Greek Civil War. Right after World War II, Greece became the site of the first Cold War proxy conflict. The fighting was between the Greek National Army, backed first by the British and then heavily supported by the United States, and the Democratic Army of Greece, a communist insurgent force supported logistically and ideologically by Yugoslavia, Albania, and Bulgaria, all within the Soviet sphere. The DSE used guerrilla tactics, launching ambushes, sabotage operations, and surprise offensives from mountain strongholds along the northern borders. The National Army, struggling at first, was reorganized and better equipped thanks to American military advisors and new U.S. supplies, including rifles, artillery, and aircraft. The turning point came in 1948-49 with the Battle of Gramoz-Vitsi, where coordinated attacks using heavy artillery and air power pushed the guerrillas out of their mountain positions. The U.S.-backed forces used napalm for the first time in Europe, devastating enemy hideouts. By late 1949, the DSE had lost key support from Tito's Yugoslavia and couldn't withstand the pressure. The communists fled or surrendered, and the war ended with over 150,000 casualties. The conflict firmly aligned Greece with the West, but militarily, it showed how Cold War battles would be fought, indirectly, brutally, and across borders. The Korean War. After World War II, Korea had been split along the 38th parallel, the North under communist control and the South under a US-backed regime. In June 1950, North Korea launched a surprise invasion, rapidly pushing South Korean forces and their American allies into a desperate defense around Pusan. The tide turned with a bold amphibious landing at Incheon, orchestrated by General Douglas MacArthur, which cut off North Korean supply lines and forced a retreat. UN forces pushed deep into the north, nearing the Chinese border. That's when China entered the war, sending hundreds of thousands of troops into battle and triggering brutal back-and-forth fighting in freezing conditions. The war eventually settled into a stalemate near the original border. In 1953, an armistice was signed, but no peace treaty ever followed, leaving Korea technically still at war. Over 3 million people died, most of them Korean civilians. The Korean War showed that Cold War proxy wars wouldn't just involve advisors and supplies. They could mean massive armies, devastating destruction, and no clear winners. Yom Kippur War. On October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. Their goal was to retake lands lost in the Six-Day War of 1967, especially the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. Caught off guard, Israel suffered early losses, but the United States quickly stepped in. Over the next days, the U.S. began Operation Nickel Grass, an emergency airlift that sent thousands of tons of weapons, tanks, and aircraft to Israel. This resupply effort helped Israel push back the attackers and launch counteroffensives deep into Egyptian and Syrian territory. On the other side, the Soviet Union responded by resupplying Egypt and Syria with weapons, advisors, and intelligence. Tensions escalated fast. At one point, Moscow even threatened to send troops if Israel didn't halt its advance. The U.S. raised its nuclear alert level to DEFCON 3, the highest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The war ended with a UN-brokered ceasefire, but the near clash between the two superpowers sent shockwaves through the world. It was one of the closest moments the U.S. and USSR came to direct military confrontation during the Cold War, all because of a regional war in the Middle East. Congo Crisis. When the Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, the country almost immediately fell into chaos. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba, a nationalist leader with growing ties to the Soviet Union, wanted to keep Congo united and independent. But regional leaders rebelled, and the mineral-rich province of Katanga tried to break away with support from Belgian business interests. The United States saw Lumumba as a threat. Fearing he'd bring the Soviets into Central Africa, the CIA began working with Congolese army officers, including a young commander named Joseph Mobutu. With U.S. backing, Mobutu seized power and Lumumba was eventually captured, tortured, and executed in 1961, with indirect involvement from both the U.S. and Belgian agents. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had sent advisors and support to Lumumba's side. After his death, Moscow condemned the West and tried to support his followers, but with limited success. By 1965, Mobutu had taken full control and turned the Congo into a pro-Western dictatorship. For the US, it was a Cold War victory. But for Congo, it marked the beginning of decades of authoritarian rule, civil unrest, and outside interference. The Angolan Civil War. When Portugal withdrew from Angola in 1975, the power vacuum sparked a fierce civil war that became one of the most internationalized proxy conflicts of the Cold War. Three main factions vied for control: the MPLA, Marxist-Leninist, backed by the Soviet Union and Cuba; the UNITA, supported by the United States and South Africa; and the FNLA, which received early backing from the US and Zaire. The MPLA declared itself the government and took control of the capital, Luanda. In response, South Africa invaded from the south to support UNITA and halt the spread of communism. Cuba responded by sending thousands of troops and military advisors to bolster the MPLA. The Soviets provided tanks, aircraft, and logistical support. Major battles unfolded across Angola, with South African armored columns clashing with Cuban forces in the south. The war was brutal, involving child soldiers, landmines, and mass displacement. Despite U.S. aid, including Stinger missiles and covert CIA support, UNITA failed to defeat the MPLA. A peace deal was signed in the 1990s, but fighting continued until UNITA leader Jonas Savimbi was killed in 2002. Only then did the war truly end. Angola's civil war left over 500,000 dead and became one of the longest-running proxy wars of the Cold War era. The Soviet-Afghan War. In December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up a collapsing communist government in Kabul. What followed was one of the most iconic proxy wars of the Cold War and a costly quagmire for Moscow. The Soviets deployed over 100,000 troops to fight the Mujahideen, a collection of Afghan resistance fighters made up of tribal groups, Islamic nationalists, and local warlords. But the Mujahideen weren't alone. The United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China poured in money, weapons, and training. The CIA launched Operation Cyclone, one of its longest and most expensive covert ops ever. The government of Pakistan acted as a middleman, secretly passing along American-supplied weapons, including portable missiles capable of shooting down helicopters, to the Afghan fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. Soviet forces found themselves stuck in mountainous terrain, facing ambushes, improvised explosive devices, and an enemy that blended into the civilian population. Despite deploying tanks, gunships, and chemical weapons, they couldn't gain control beyond the cities. By the late 1980s, Soviet morale had collapsed. Casualties mounted. Over 15,000 Soviet soldiers died, and tens of thousands more were wounded. With pressure mounting at home and abroad, the USSR began withdrawing in 1988, completing its pullout by 1989. The war left Afghanistan devastated, but it also drained Soviet resources and confidence. Many historians see it as a major factor in the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union just 2 years later. And if you want to keep learning about how history really unfolded behind the scenes, make sure to subscribe. Let's keep going.